Alexander Hamilton was in George Washington's cabinet. He's the first Treasury Secretary, of course. He has a sort of a grand economic vision, and part of that vision entailed taxing luxury goods. Alexander Hamilton's economic vision depended upon the assumption by the federal government of the state government's debt, and that assumption plan only works if he can raise taxes, excise taxes, establish excise taxes, and in particular on luxury goods like carriages, okay? But also a 25% excise tax on all distilled spirits. Now you could say that the tax on carriages is a tax on the rich, and apparently that's okay. But a tax on distilled spirits, this came to be known as the whiskey tax, because far and away the most popular distilled spirit in America is whiskey. And a tax on whiskey will hurt most those small-time distillers who are eking out survival in the wilderness in places like western Pennsylvania, where I am. The small farmers here, they grow corn, but the corn cannot survive the long, arduous journey along those uneven roads to the eastern markets. And so it's often distilled into whiskey. And then kegs of whiskey, they actually can survive the long, uneven roads to those eastern markets. And backcountry folk use whiskey as currency besides. So the whiskey tax, generally seen as a tax on the poor. Hardscrabble farmers in these parts not only resented the tax itself, but they resented its enforcers, or revenuers as they called them, revenuers, whose methods were often seen as intrusive. In fact, during the congressional debates on this topic, on Hamilton's assumption plan, some had warned that the excise tax proposal would, quote, let loose a swarm of harpies who, under the denomination of revenue officers, will range through the country, prying into every man's house and affairs, and like a Macedonian phalanx, bear down all before them. Had these not been prescient observations? And what's worse, maybe, is that all the distillers, all these distillers of spirits, were forced to, or by the law were supposed to, register their businesses in a federal court. Well, if you're living out here in western Pennsylvania along the frontier, in the backcountry, west of the Appalachians, the only federal court, and the nearest federal court you can go to is in Philadelphia, hundreds of miles away, across wilderness, across those long, uneven roads. So it really puts the western farmers at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their larger eastern competitors. It seems corrupt. I mean, wasn't this worse than the measly stamp tax that had sparked a revolution? The excise law, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Madison, is an infernal one. For years, settlers in the West, in areas like this, had had a simmering resentment against the government in the East. They'd felt neglected. Okay, you have these frontier farmers hacking a subsistence level life often out of what they saw as untamed wilderness. Meanwhile, back in the coastal cities, the corporatist elites and their political agents prospered. Okay, so that seemed unfair. And now, of course, legislation had been drawn up by the federal government that clearly favored the eastern competitors, the larger, more established eastern competitors of small-time distillers in the West. In fact, it seemed like legislation that especially squeezed the poorest, most underrepresented of American citizens, namely the frontier folk. Okay? So there's a lot of anger, there's resentment. In fact, so much so that many of these guys begin getting together with their neighbors and signing covenants with one another, promising never ever to pay the hated whiskey tax. In fact, some of the small-time distillers even threatened their neighbors, their busybody neighbors, that is, should they ever get the idea to report on their operations to the federal government. In late 1791, a federal tax collector was accosted, stripped, tarred, and feathered by a western Pennsylvania mob. Now, he lived, but other federal agents were likewise targeted, beaten, publicly shamed, and as a result, tax collection plummeted. In fact, we often think of this as the Whiskey Rebellion, as a Western Pennsylvania thing, but it was much bigger than that. Tax collection basically ground to a halt, at least this excise tax, the whiskey tax, all along the Appalachians and west of the Appalachians. We're talking from Kentucky all the way down to Georgia. So this wasn't just Western Pennsylvania, but the epicenter was here. Prominent Western Pennsylvania attorney David Bradford gave rousing political speeches against the United States government. Pacifist preacher and ardent Democrat and pamphleteer Herman Husband erected a liberty pole in his hometown, Brunerstown, modern-day Somerset, PA, in Brunerstown. A liberty pole upon which was affixed the standard liberty and no excise. Does that sound familiar? Now, there are echoes here of the American Revolution. In fact, the American Revolution was a revolution of secession, the 13 colonies seceding from the British Empire. And now people in Western Pennsylvania and beyond are beginning to talk about out-and-out secession. Well, the U.S. opted to renew its collection efforts, its tax collection efforts, in 1794. To carry those efforts out, the federal government hired a well-to-do gentleman from Virginia, a Revolutionary War veteran named John Neville. Given Neville's background, they couldn't have picked a worse candidate, a worse person for the job, at least in the context of Western Pennsylvania, the small farmers here on the frontier. So Neville's from Virginia, so he is, by definition, an outsider. Okay, so that's point number one. He's also well-to-do. He's a part of the sort of American aristocratic class, so he's a member of the hated elite. Third, he's a stickler for strict obedience to the law. Okay, so that means he's not amenable to compromise. And worst of all, he runs his own whiskey distilling operations. So that makes him literally direct competition to the small Western farmers and distillers out here. Okay, so if these tax rebels, if the whiskey rebels weren't convinced before of the federal government's nefarious motivations, well, they are now. And when John Neville, in July of 1794, served summonses to some of these very tax rebels, keep in mind, summonses to appear in court way far away in Philadelphia, well, these suspicions are all confirmed. And eventually a mob that included some of the local militia, by the way, gathered around John Neville's house. In fact, I'm standing on the site of John Neville's mansion. The mob gathered right here on Bower Hill. There used to be a mansion here. They surrounded the house. Shots are fired from within, shots are fired from the mob into the house, shots are fired from within the house out into the mob. One tax rebel was actually killed as those in the house defended themselves, and so the mob retreated. Well, even though the mob had retreated, it continued to grow. Its size continued to grow until there were about 700 men. By the evening, by nighttime, there were 700 men in this mob. So the mob returned to the house. But in the meantime, a contingent of U.S. Army, so these are federal forces, had arrived at Neville's house to protect it, and they'd surrounded the house. So they're right here surrounding Neville's house. The mob comes back even bigger, and a battle ensues. So this really is a civil war. A battle ensues between local tax rebels and federal forces surrounding Neville's house. Now, in the battle, maybe a couple of the U.S. Army soldiers are killed. Meanwhile, 3 or 4 of the tax rebels are shot and killed. But somehow, the commander of the U.S. forces falls into the hands of the tax rebels. They're able to capture him. And having captured him, they proceed to burn John Neville's mansion to the ground. Well, by August, a 5,000-man army, a rebel army, is marching through the streets of Pittsburgh, albeit peacefully, but marching through the streets of Pittsburgh. And you might ask, well, why didn't the governor quell this rebellion, the Pennsylvania governor? That's a good question. It seems that he felt that quelling the rebellion would lose him the support of much of his constituency. So dwell on that for a minute. Well, for George Washington's part, he listened to the advice of Alexander Hamilton and decided that a military response, with him at the head, was required here. For Washington, federal authority, order, yes, but federal authority must be restored. That's the important thing here. And so he leads a 13,000-man army. 13,000-man army. To put that in perspective, that's more than he commanded actively on a battlefield throughout virtually the entire American Revolution. He leads that army out here in western Pennsylvania. 13,000 troops. And as officers over this army, he has a nice assemblage of Revolutionary War vets. Men like Daniel Morgan, men like Henry Lee, Alexander Hamilton, of course. All these officers, by the way, all these officers are federal bondholders. That means that, technically speaking, they are marching out here to collect on their investments. And it does add another layer of context to this whole episode. Anyway, this is the first time in American history under the current Constitution, that the U.S. military has been sicked on American citizens. Well, the approach of a federal army with none other than George Washington at its head was apparently enough to help more moderate voices to prevail here. Moderate voices like those of Albert Gallatin. I'm at Albert Gallatin's estate in western Pennsylvania, really awesome house. This is called Friendship Hill. You can see we're way up. This was his house. He was a very well-respected guy, Swiss-born, American citizen, very, very well-known in the area, great supporter of the Whiskey Rebellion, believed that their grievances were very legitimate. And yet, in the face of this oncoming federal army, he felt that any sort of attempt to meet them militarily would be futile. And so he cautioned moderation, and the rebellion began to sort of fizzle. The rebels scattered. And so when Washington and his men show up here, there really is nothing happening anymore. The rebels are gone, there's no pitched battles, none of that stuff. Now, the mere presence of Washington in this region with his army to put down the tax revolt, that's a poke in the eye to the small farmers and small-time distillers here, all by itself. But the fact that Washington's army is short of supplies and thus heads to farm after farm after farm to expropriate food and other resources, that's an even worse poke in the eye. Even worse than that, though, every male in every household in this region is forced in the presence of federal troops to sign an oath of allegiance to the federal government. Now imagine that. So pretty humiliating for a lot of the people around here who feel like they have no choice. Of course, there's that threat of violence implicit in the presence of these troops as they're signing these oaths. In the end, only about 150 men are taken into custody by Washington and his army. They're interrogated. They're imprisoned in wretched conditions here. They're threatened with hanging. And eventually, they're marched the 400 miles back to Philadelphia, where they are paraded through the streets in chains. Think of that. In chains. And then imprisoned again. One of those men, by the way, was Herman Husband. Now, virtually all of those imprisoned were eventually freed, but not before spending months behind bars, many of them without charge. By the way, this enraged Alexander Hamilton, who greatly supported execution. These people must be taught a lesson. They must be executed. That didn't happen. Of the 23 or so who were tried, only a few, 2 or 3, were found guilty. And one of those was Herman Husband, who was condemned to death, but George Washington pardoned him and another guy who was found guilty. In fact, the only one who wasn't pardoned was the attorney, David Bradford, whose political speeches were considered to have incited much of the rebellion. So he was not pardoned. He actually escaped to exile in Florida, or actually Louisiana. At the time it was called Spanish West Florida, so controlled by Spain. He escapes to Spanish-controlled territory. He lives there for 4 years until finally President John Adams pardons him too. Men like Gallatin loudly complained that the federal response to the so-called Whiskey Rebellion had been extreme. It had been an example of federal overreach. Meanwhile, you have many of these former so-called anti-federalists. Remember that label, anti-federalist, given to these people who called themselves Republicans by their political enemies. For one reason or another, that name stuck. So many of these so-called anti-federalists, or those who had been anti-federalists during the ratification period, a lot of them are looking on and saying, see, this is exactly the sort of tyrannical action that we feared that would come as a result of the great consolidation under the new Constitution. Was this what the American Revolution had been fought to establish? Weren't those original American revolutionaries fighting against distant, corrupt government, against corrupt and unjust taxation? While the violent response of Western farmers to the whiskey tax had failed to head off a strong federal response, that strong federal response in turn failed to actually enforce payment of the tax. Okay, despite everything the federal government did, marching out here with 13,000 troops, George Washington himself at their head, all of the oaths of allegiance and the interrogations and the arrests and the marching in chains back to Philadelphia and parading through the streets and the trials and the condemning to death and all of that, farmers in the West and all along the American frontier continued not to pay. Okay, so in terms of enforcement, the federal response did not work. In fact, maybe because of the Whiskey Rebellion, internal excise taxes like the whiskey tax were virtually non-existent after the Whiskey Rebellion in the United States for the next 60 years. The whiskey tax itself was repealed in 1802 by Thomas Jefferson, and the only time you see internal excise taxes really cropping up briefly is during the War of 1812, again briefly, and that's during war. Then you see in the 1830s under Andrew Jackson, such internal excise taxes are officially abolished, and they don't crop up again until the Civil War. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive into history, consider one of my full courses, each including something like 400 plus pages of text, 30 plus hours of audio, 50, 60, 70 on-location videos filmed all over the world, plus all the scaffolding you could ask for should you want to take it like a traditional student. We're talking guided notes, both blank and filled, quizzes, structure training, document lessons. These really are unique and one of a kind. Check them out. Also, if you want to support what I do here, consider joining Nomad Nation, where you'll gain exclusive access to monthly webinars, Q&A, a monthly newsletter called Nomad Notes, special live stream events from all over the world. I'll send you 4 postcards a year, discounts. Go check all this out at nomadicprofessor.com.